On the night of October the 11th, 1931, a United States Forest Service ranger named Silas Rourke came down out of the black spruce above Bitter Creek and walked into the Corbeau County Sheriff's Substation carrying a canvas rucksack, a rifle he had not fired, and a field journal so soaked through at the spine that the pages had begun to separate from the binding. He asked Deputy Warren Pryce, 29 years old and alone on the night shift, for two things only: a pen and enough paper to set down everything in the order it had happened, before the order left him the way a dream leaves a man by breakfast. Pryce would say afterward that Rourke's hands shook too badly to work his own gloves loose, and that when the gloves finally came off, 3 fingers on the left hand were white to the second knuckle, with a frost that had no business forming on a night that had not yet dropped below 40 degrees. Rourke sat at the deputy's own desk without being asked. He set beside the inkwell an object wrapped in oilcloth that he would not unwrap and would not name. Then he began to write, and he did not stop for 6 hours. By the time the sun came up over the tamarack flats east of town, Silas Rourke had vanished from the jailhouse outhouse 40 feet from where the deputy stood watching the door, and the only trace of him left anywhere in Corbeau County was the journal on the desk and a line of boot prints crossing the frost toward the tree line, spaced a stride too long for any man walking. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Corbeau County sat in the high timber country of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, 4 hours by rail from the nearest telegraph office south of the Straits, and considerably longer than that in a wet spring when the rail bridge at Corbeau Falls washed out, which it did most years. The county had been logged hard through the 1890s and left half wild afterward, the big pine gone to a second growth of poplar and black spruce that closed over the old skid roads within a decade. Bitter Creek ran through the northern third of the county, a name the surveyors had kept from the Ojibwe families who had trapped and fished the drainage long before Corbeau Falls existed, and who had told the first land agents, plainly and more than once, that the upper stretch of the creek was no place to winter livestock or to build a permanent camp. The land agents wrote this down as a superstition about poor drainage. Nobody who actually lived along Bitter Creek called it that. 9 year-round households worked the country above the forks in 1931, mostly trapping families and 1 Forest Service lookout station, and every one of them kept their stock closer to the house than the pasture called for. None of them could say exactly why. It was simply done that way, the way a family keeps a gate latched without remembering which grandfather first told them to. Silas Rourke had held the Bitter Creek district for 9 years by the fall of 1931, and every man who worked timber or trapped fur in that country knew his name the way they knew the man who ran the feed store. He had come up from downstate as a young man, trained under an older ranger who retired the year Rourke took the district, and he was known for 2 things: a memory for game trails that outdid any survey the Forest Service had on file, and a refusal to carry a sidearm on patrol, which he explained by saying that a man who needed a pistol in that country had already made a mistake a pistol would not fix. He kept a station log the way the job required, weather and fire risk and timber trespass, and for 9 years that log read like every other ranger's log in the district. In the last 2 weeks of September 1931, it stopped reading that way. The first entry that broke the pattern was dated September the 22nd. Rourke had gone up to check a trapper's line above the forks after the trapper, a man named Adin Solberg, failed to come down for his monthly supply run for the 2nd month running. Rourke found Solberg's cabin locked from the inside with no one home, the stove cold enough to suggest it had been that way for weeks, and every trap on the line sprung and empty, the jaws bent outward as though something had stepped into them and kept walking. He found no blood. He found no drag marks. What he found, and recorded in a hand far steadier than the hand that would write the final pages a month later, was a deer carcass 40 yards off the trail, with every long bone split open and the marrow taken clean, the snow around it melted back in a perfect circle nearly 6 feet across, on a morning that had held at 26 degrees since before dawn. Rourke reported the missing trapper to the county sheriff's office that same week, and Sheriff Hollis Vantine sent 2 deputies up to look. They found nothing beyond what Rourke had already logged, and the case went into the county daybook as a man presumed drowned or lost, the kind of entry that closes a file in that country without closing anything at all. Rourke did not close his own file. He kept walking the district through the first 2 weeks of October, and the log he kept, private and separate from the official one, began to read less like a ranger's report and more like a hunting record kept by a man who had quietly decided he was no longer patrolling for fire risk. By October the 2nd, he had found 4 more kill sites in a 10-mile stretch above the Forks, each one showing the same melted circle in otherwise unbroken frost, each one stripped of marrow with a thoroughness no wolf or bear in that country had ever shown. He began, in that week's entries, to describe tracks. Close to the shape of a bare human foot, but longer, some entries say 16 inches, and some closer to 18, with a stride between them, measured against his own boot, running 5 to 6 feet on level ground. He wrote that the tracks never wandered the way an animal's tracks wander while foraging. They moved in straight lines from kill site to kill site, as though the thing making them already knew exactly where it was going. On October the 4th, Rourke drove to the cabin of a trapping family named Kettridge on the Lower Creek, the nearest year-round household to where he had been finding the sites, and asked the eldest son, a 19-year-old named Otis, if the family had heard or seen anything out of the ordinary. Otis said his grandmother, who had trapped that country since before the county was organized, had told him as a boy never to answer if he heard his own name called from the trees at night, because the thing that called it that way was not calling to be friendly. She used a word for it that she had learned from an Ojibwe family who had wintered near the Forks 2 generations back, a word she made him promise never to speak aloud outdoors, only indoors, and only when it could not be avoided. Otis would not repeat the word to Rourke either. He said only that his grandmother had described the same thing Rourke was describing without ever being told what Rourke had found. Something that had once been a man, or had been a man for a long time before it stopped being one, driven by a hunger that eating never touched, because what it hungered for was not food in any sense a body could satisfy. Rourke wrote Otis Kettridge's account into his private log word for word, and beneath it wrote a single line Deputy Pryce would later underline twice. If the boy is right, I have been tracking the wrong thing for 2 weeks. I have been tracking an animal. It is not an animal. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories, like this one. By the 2nd week of October, Rourke stopped filing his official district reports altogether, a lapse the Forest Service Supervisor's office in Marquette would later note but never formally investigate, since the man who would have investigated it, a supervisor named Garrett Fain, resigned his post the following spring and left the Upper Peninsula for good. He gave no public reason, though in a private letter to a colleague, surfaced decades later in a university archive, he wrote only that some districts were better left to run themselves, and that he understood, too late to matter, exactly what that meant. What Rourke did instead, in those last 11 days, was build a trap. He wrote about it in careful, almost bureaucratic detail, the way a man writes when the writing itself is the only thing holding him steady. He chose a narrows above the Forks where the creek pinched down to 11 feet across, and the bank rose steep on both sides, a natural chute that every set of tracks he had measured seemed to pass through. He rigged a deadfall from 3 peeled logs, weighted with creekstone and hung from a trigger line of new hemp rope, built not to kill but to pin, because he had decided, and wrote plainly that he had decided, that he wanted whatever this was alive long enough to be seen by someone besides himself. He set the trap on October the 8th and watched it from a blind of cut spruce boughs for 3 nights running, sleeping in short stretches with his rifle unloaded beside him, a detail he explained by writing that he did not believe a bullet would be the thing that ended this, one way or the other. On the 4th night, October the 11th, it came. Rourke's account of what happened at the Narrows fills the last 4 pages of the journal, and it is the only part of the record Deputy Pryce, in the one interview he ever gave about that night, refused to summarize in his own words. What follows is drawn from the entry itself, as Rourke set it down before his handwriting began to change partway through the 3rd page. He heard it before he saw it, a dragging, uneven walk coming down the game trail on the far bank, and when it crossed into the open ground above the chute, he saw a shape close to 7 feet at the shoulder, gaunt past anything a starving man could account for, moving upright on legs that bent wrong at the joint. It stood at the edge of the water for what he judged a quarter of an hour, not drinking, only standing, and the whole time he could hear, faintly, a low working of the jaw and throat that was not breathing and was not speech, a sound he wrote he could feel in his own chest before he could properly hear it in his ears. When it started down through the Narrows, the deadfall came down clean, pinning it at the shoulder and hip against the near bank. It did not thrash the way a trapped animal thrashes. It turned its head, slowly, and looked directly at the blind where Rourke was hidden, though he wrote there was no way, by sight or sound, that it should have known he was there. Then it spoke. Rourke wrote that the words were not in any language he knew, and that he understood none of them as words at all, only as a pressure arriving somewhere behind his sternum and translating itself into meaning without passing through his ears. It said his name. Then it said the word Otis Kettridge's grandmother had refused to let her grandson speak outdoors, and hearing it did something to him he would not describe further, except to say that his hands would not stop shaking for the rest of the night. He cut a small section of hide from its shoulder to carry back as proof, as he had planned from the start, and he wrote that the wound closed over on its own before he had finished wrapping the sample in oilcloth, closed the way water closes over a dropped stone. Then it watched him climb out of the chute and walk away. It did not fight the rope even once. Walking back toward the truck in the dark, he understood that it had allowed every part of what had just happened, from the moment it first crossed onto the open ground. The last page of the journal was the one Pryce found hardest to read aloud. Rourke's hand, steady through 4 pages of careful field notation, breaks apart across the final lines into 5 separate attempts at the same sentence, each one struck through except the last. The first reads, "I do not believe I caught it." The second reads, "I believe it wished to be found." The third and fourth are illegible past the first several words. The fifth, pressed into the page hard enough to tear through to the sheet beneath it, is the line with which the journal ends. It let me bring it this far because the building was closer than the tree line, and it did not want to walk the whole way itself. Sheriff Vantine sealed the journal in the county records office the following week, along with Pryce's written statement and a brief, unsigned note from the Forest Service District Office declining further comment. The official file on Silas Rourke lists him as missing, presumed lost in the timber, cause undetermined. 2 pages are missing from the daybook, covering the 11 days of the search that followed, cut close to the spine rather than torn, the stub still visible and even along the gutter of the binding. Nobody in the county records office today can say when the pages were removed or by whom, only that they were already gone by the time the book was transferred to permanent storage in 1952. Deputy Pryce left the Sheriff's Department 8 months after that night and did not work in law enforcement again. He ran a hardware store 2 counties south until his death in 1968, and in the one interview he ever gave 20 years after the fact, to a graduate student researching Upper Peninsula folklore, he would only say that he had read the journal exactly once in full, the morning after Rourke disappeared, and never again, and that he still, 4 decades later, would not sleep in a room without a lamp lit somewhere in it. Rourke was not the last person from that stretch of country to describe the same thing, and he was not the first either. In 1889, a timber cruiser named Corliss Amsden, working a boundary survey south of the Forks for a logging outfit out of Escanaba, wrote in a letter to his brother, later donated to a regional historical society, that he had come across tracks he could not identify, close to 16 inches long, walking a course too straight for any animal, and that he had heard, 3 nights running, something calling his given name from a stand of black spruce he had not told anyone he intended to camp near that week. Amsden left the timber trade within the month, moved his family to Wisconsin, and according to the same letter collection, never again slept a night under an open sky if he could help it. In 1957, a hunting guide named Delmar Ostrander, leading 2 clients above the Forks, reported to the same sheriff's department that his lead client had wandered from camp after midnight, following what he swore afterward was his own late father's voice calling him toward the creek, and had to be physically restrained before he crossed the water in the dark. Ostrander's report, filed and quietly set aside, used a phrase that appears nowhere else in any Corbeau County record before or since, and that Deputy Pryce, reading it decades after his own night with Rourke's journal, recognized at once, a hunger with a voice attached to it. 3 men, separated by 70 years and never once acquainted with one another's accounts, had each reached, independently, for the same description. The trap at the Narrows was found the following spring by a Forest Service survey crew sent to reassess the district after Rourke's disappearance. The peeled logs were there, and the hemp rope, uncut and untied, coiled loosely at the base of the deadfall, the way a man coils rope when he has chosen to set something free rather than cut it loose in a hurry. There was no blood anywhere at the site. There was, according to the crew's brief and largely dismissed report, a stretch of bank near the chute where the ground had been disturbed in a pattern none of them could account for. Not a den, not a kill site, not a camp. Something closer, one man wrote, to a place where a very large body had rested for a long time and then simply gotten up. The journal survived. It passed from the sealed county archive into the private hands of a Corbeau Falls Historical Society in the 1970s, where it remains today, available to researchers who write ahead and give a reason the society finds sufficient, which is not often. The oilcloth packet Rourke carried down from the Narrows that night was never found among his effects, and no one who has signed the archive's guest log across 5 decades has ever admitted to seeing it. Bitter Creek still runs cold above the Forks in every season but one short stretch below the old chute, where trappers who still work that country say the ice comes in late and goes out early, for no reason the water temperature above or below it can explain. The Kettridge family sold their land in 1961 and gave no reason why. And somewhere in the black spruce north of where a young deputy once stood, watching an outhouse door in the last dark hour before sunrise, a set of boot prints crossed the frost in a stride too long for any man, walked north, and did not come back. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.